Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. Today, we are finally doing it. We are doing the absolutely most requested subject I have ever received. We are discussing the moon landing. And as a quick side note for all those who are wondering why it's taken so long to create this episode, this subject was originally slated to be the pilot of the series. However, it was lost when I was creating the first trial season, when the computer I was doing it on at the time completely blue screened and I was unable to recover that file. That's literally why the Lost Cosmonauts episode is the pilot episode. But it's all for the best because back then I was such an amateur, I didn't know anything about sound editing or podcasting in general, to be honest. To the point where what I would have released back then would have been complete garbage. So you're getting it now, 2 years on. So without further ado, let's go back to the pilot. The moon landing, the grandfather of all conspiracy theories. So the moon landing conspiracy is very simple. It basically states that Apollos 11 through 17 did not land on the moon. And proponents of this theory will particularly focus on Apollo 11, but they'll also cherry pick data from subsequent moon landings, so they're essentially saying that man never went to the moon. They will generally state that it was all produced on a soundstage, usually out at Area 51. They will state that various imagery we see coming from the moon landings just doesn't make sense. A lot of them will say that we didn't have the technology at the time to get to the moon. They'll usually also use that tired argument that we don't have the technology today to get to the moon, because if we did have that technology, why did it disappear and why haven't we been back since? They'll also harp on things like how the shadows aren't perfectly parallel or how it looks like it's a soundstage in the background. And they really love to talk about the shadows. They get obsessive over the shadows. They bitch about stars not being visible in the background. And they obsess over the radiation issue, particularly when it comes to the Van Allen belts. Basically, if you say anything, they'll pick it apart, just like they're gonna pick apart everything I have to say today about this subject. Because while they claim to be experts on everything and, quote, critical thinkers, we find very quickly during their arguments that they have no clue what they're usually talking about. They don't know anything about cameras or physics or even what the moon is. And all of their arguments are essentially a bunch of ignorant bullshit. I'll just come out and say it. It's fucking stupid. And I will be perfectly blunt. I have no fear. It's my show. I can do whatever I want. These people who propose this conspiracy theory, I guarantee you, they were the same kids who were at the back of the class, who were sleeping, who were getting D's and F's all through their science classes. They probably took the same remedial science class all through high school. And they're basically that same vein of people who are just the absolute worst and dumbest members of our society. They are true products of the failure that is the American education system. But I digress. But this is essentially what they believe. They believe that the moon landing was this big conspiracy between thousands of government workers in Hollywood in order to showcase to the world American supremacy, and we were going to gain that American supremacy by landing a man on the moon, thus winning the space race, and essentially, I guess, demoralizing the Soviet space program because of fears that if the Soviets got up there, they would use it as a nuclear launch pad. But it's all this big, grand conspiracy involving thousands of people over 10 years of work, all in order to win a pissing race. And to be perfectly blunt, I'm not going to indulge that. I'm going to spend the next, I don't know how long this episode's going to be, let's say half hour to an hour, telling you exactly why those jokers are wrong. Well, mostly wrong, like 95% wrong. Some of that Russian US propaganda space race stuff was correct, partially. But let's get into it. To really get into it, we have to start at the beginning, and I'm not talking about the beginning of the space race. Hell, I'm not talking about the tail end of World War II, where I absolutely love to start these Cold War subjects. No, we have to go way back to the beginning. I'm talking about the formation of the moon itself. Because, to be perfectly honest, despite how skeptical I get on some things, the Earth-Moon system is very weird. It's very unique. It's unlike any other planetary moon system that we know of. So we have to look into that. Now, most of the time when a planet acquires a moon, it's usually through the orbital capture method. So you have like the moons of Jupiter, for example. Most of those moons were probably objects that got too close to Jupiter and are now like circling Jupiter because it's a gas giant. And I think it's even kind of the same with Mars and its two moons, Deimos and Phobos. I think those were captured objects because they're not very big. They're basically specks in the Martian night sky. But our moon is huge in comparison with our planet. And in fact, just to make sure I'm not talking out of my ass here, I just looked it up. It is the most massive satellite in relation to its parent planet in our solar system, as well as being the 5th largest moon in our solar system. Its mass is 1.2% of that of the Earth, and its diameter is 3,474 kilometers, or in freedom units, 2,150 miles, roughly 1/4 of the Earth when you make that comparison. So the Earth-Moon system is weird. It's most likely that the moon wasn't a captured object by Earth. The most general accepted scientific consensus about the moon is it was formed when this other planetoid-sized object way back early in Earth's formation, back when it was still kind of a molten rock, so like 4.51 billion years ago. This other large object, which most scientists refer to as Theia, it was kind of like a rogue planet in the early solar system, slammed into Earth, and it shot all this debris out into Earth's orbit, and that debris kind of accreted and formed our moon. And at that time, our moon was extremely close to Earth. And slowly over the billions of years, that moon, that satellite, it inches away from Earth. Its revolution around the Earth actually increases about 38 millimeters or 1.5 inches per year, which is kind of crazy when you think about it in terms of humanity, because right now, while humans exist on this planet, we can get like full solar eclipses just based on the distance of where the moon is from the Earth right now in relation to the sun and all that stuff. But eventually, in several 100 million or billion years, those eclipses won't be perfect anymore, so it's an interesting little tidbit. But currently, as it sits, the moon is on average 389,000 kilometers. A lot of people round that up to 400,000 kilometers. Or in freedoms, 250,000 freedoms from Earth. Or if you want to get really crazy, 1.28 light seconds. And get ready for more of that throughout this episode. I'm going to be throwing out random moon facts left and right, mostly in order to destroy the credibility of these claims. So the Earth-Moon system, I admit, is very weird and unique. And since the dawn of humanity, people have looked up at the moon, and it has been a source of everything. It has been depicted as a god or a goddess. The shadows upon the moon's surface have inspired countless stories and legends. Go listen to my 3rd season episode on the moon rabbit. Sound quality sucks, but it's personally one of my favorites. To be honest, that actually inspired the previous artwork of the podcast. If you remember that, it was the depiction of Death Bunny in the full moon during that eclipse, if you remember that art. On a side note, I spent 4 hours picking out that font, but it was a great logo until I created the current logo and redesigned Death Bunny. And for those who don't know, it's just some interesting history about the podcast. I actually hand drew that original depiction of Death Bunny, that outline. But when I created the new artwork, I felt like it needed a redesign. So I don't know, do you like the old one or do you like the new one better? Let me know if you've actually listened to it and remember the old logo. But I'm getting sidetracked here. Let's get back to the moon. So for countless millennia, people have looked up to the moon. It has been with us forever. And I guarantee you one major thought throughout all of human history was, I wonder if one day man will be able to walk upon the moon. Or could man one day fly to the moon? And if we flew to the moon, what would we find up there? Will we find other civilizations? Will we find little moon people? Or, I don't know, is it a scary place filled with spiders? And I don't know, moon alligators. And I'm just thinking about it now, that's probably why we haven't been back. Giant moon spiders and alligators. Yeah, that would keep me from wanting to go too. But to be honest, it really wasn't until the dawn of the 20th century when any kind of practical research was placed in even the thought of getting beyond Earth's orbit. And this didn't grow out of the idea of the airplane and human flight. This grew out of a much older idea, the idea of rocketry. And for rocketry, we really have to dive back into ancient China and the basic discovery of gunpowder. Now, gunpowder first shows up in China. I think the earliest mentions of it are around 808 AD. And this was back when China was still giving us awesome stuff like gunpowder and printed movable type and rockets and blast furnaces, unlike today where all China is giving us is extremely cheaply made consumer goods which are usually toxic, respiratory viruses, and communism, but I digress. And gunpowder was created out of this search for an elixir of life. That's usually the myth around it. So these alchemists in China, roughly during this time, are creating all these concoctions in order to create medicines. And in creating these medicines, they're really looking for this elixir of eternal life. And eventually they come across the recipe for gunpowder, which is very simple. It's sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. For those wondering, that's two fuels in an oxidizer. So sulfur and charcoal are your fuels and saltpeter is your oxidizer. And that creates explosions, and they quickly find practical purposes for this new invention. And one of those practical purposes was in warfare. They quickly figured out that you could create essentially fire arrows. So these were arrows that were basically rocket propelled. I think my best way of describing that is imagine if a bottle rocket was carrying an arrow. Quickly over the coming centuries, this evolves and arises, and even by the 1300s in Korea, you have accounts of people essentially using rocket launchers on the battlefield, and these are all being propelled with gunpowder. And this is really the first scientific inquiry into rocketry. We eventually get to rockets as fireworks, so it's the first time we're seeing something man-made going up into the air and exploding. A rocket, basically. Now, eventually rockets make its way to the west, and they're basically used to illuminate battlefields for the most part. And this was particularly at night, so during the raid on the Alamo, the Mexican army was firing rockets over the Alamo in order to illuminate the early morning sky because it was still dark. Rockets, by the 1800s, they're essentially glorified fireworks. There's nothing really special about them. They're just supposed to fire, go bang, they're one-time use, and that's that. And hell, there's not really any way to control them. You basically just point it in the general direction and hope it goes in that general direction. It wasn't until 1903 when we first get some real scientific practical research in rocketry. So in this year, a high school math teacher by the name of Konstantin Teslavsky, he comes up with the Teslavsky rocket equation. And this is essentially a calculus formula that describes the motion of a vehicle which follows the basic principle of a rocket. So you can essentially calculate fuel to mass and all that fun stuff. And he's one of the first proponents of liquid-fueled rockets, as opposed to solid fuel rockets, which we've been used to since the age of gunpowder. His proposal was essentially liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and he actually calculated the maximum exhaust velocity of these gases. And this was all published in, I don't know if it was a book or a monograph, called The Exploration of Cosmic Space by Means of Reaction Devices, and this is considered the first serious scientific work when it comes to space travel. Then by 1912, some other scientists who are looking into this same idea basically come up with the same formula independently of each other. The most famous of these men being Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry. Now, I'm not going to go into a big biography about Robert Goddard. He was a fascinating character, but essentially he is the first American scientist to really look into these scientific applications for not only improving rockets, but getting into space. And everything in rocket science after this basically stands upon his shoulders. NASA wouldn't exist if it wasn't for people like Robert Goddard doing this early research in the teens and 20s. But a lot of his work did lead to improvements in rocketry, which we still use today. For one, he was the first to consider multi-stage rockets. Secondly, he also adapted the de Laval nozzle. This was a nozzle used in steam machinery at the time, to rocketry, and by doing so, he is able to increase the exhaust speed and the efficiency of these rockets. And these nozzles are still really critical when it comes to rocket flight today. And we can basically see what he's doing. He's doing all these tests and mathematical equations in order to increase the efficiency of rockets. And by 1920, he publishes a paper called A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. Of course, he's doing this all during a time when the idea of sending a rocket into space is still kind of in that realm of science fiction. So he does get some pushback and criticism because at the time this is fantasy. So it's not like he's really getting a lot of funding for this. He's doing a lot of this research independently. But he does create these high atmosphere rockets which go way up into the atmosphere, and they usually have some instruments on it and they're collecting atmospheric data. So by doing that, he's able to somewhat justify his research to, I guess, the people holding the purse strings. And even in Germany at the time, this research is being looked into. In 1923, Hermann Oberth, who was another one of these founding fathers of rocketry, he published a book called The Rocket into Planetary Space. This was actually a large portion of his doctoral thesis, which was rejected by the University of Munich at the time. And he follows it up in 1929 with another book called Ways to Spaceflight. And we would hear about Oberth and his works later when it came to World War II and subsequently the works that his student, a very famous man named Wernher von Braun, would contribute to the American space program. So as we can see, by the 1920s, there's this huge surge in rocket technology and rocket research. And it's happening all over the world. And the leaders of this work, these early rocket scientists, are basically physics professors. And I would largely argue that the primary reason why they're doing this isn't to create a ballistic missile or for military applications. The biggest reason they're doing this is for scientific research. Being physicists, they have a definite scientific interest in space, and they realize that rockets with enough fuel, with enough power, with the correct kind of, guidance system, can get into space. And furthermore, advances in the science, they could carry instruments into space and one day even humans into space. And I just want to reiterate, all of this is going on back in the 1920s, almost 40 years before the first human is sent up. So we have a huge background that we're building off of when it comes to this science. It's not like they woke up one day post-1945 and decided, we should start building rockets. No, the research, the testing, the foundations were already there. And of course, throughout the 30s, this becomes keen interest to the militaries because the militaries see this as a way to develop new weapons. So militaries around the world are investing money and time and labor into research, especially when it comes to the parallel emerging technology of the airplane. From a military perspective, there's this interest in the airplane because they know that one day battlefields would be dominated by your aerial support in the skies. So they're investigating hugely in rocket technology for things like ground-to-air defense, air-to-ground defense, and air-to-air combat. Because this is also the time when jet technology is being investigated. And basically the principle is if you could strap a rocket to a jet, then you have a very deadly weapon. So without going way out there into the weeds with all these scientific tests and experiments with rocket technologies throughout the 20s and the 30s, World War II kicks off. And the big thing that comes out of World War II that is going to lead us into the age of the space race is the V-2 rocket. It was a supersonic ballistic missile with a range of 320 kilometers or 200 miles. It was capable of carrying an 1,130 kilogram or, in American, 2,490 pound warhead. So let's just say 2,500 pounds. And this thing could move at 2,500 miles per hour. And this is basically the first man-made object to reach what we would call space. And these missiles were used to attack Allied targets, particularly places like London. There was a launch on Paris. And other launches at other cities that I can't remember off the top of my head. But essentially, they were ballistic missiles. They were used to deliver explosive payloads that killed people. However, their effectiveness was more psychological than anything else. Because while they did inflict damage and tragically kill people, civilians, it was still a fairly new technology. It was somewhat unreliable sometimes. And to be honest, we were already working on defense systems for this problem. Of course, World War II would come to an end, and through Operations Paperclip and Operation Al-Savakayam, ourselves and the Soviets would capture this technology, these V-2 rockets, ship all the war criminals back, and put them to work in our emerging space programs. And at the end of World War II, we had a treasure trove on our hands because we Americans had collected the equivalent of 300 railroad cars worth of V-2 engines, fuselages, propellant tanks, gyroscopes, and other associated equipment, and that was all brought to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where the American space program really kicks off. But of course, this is the 40s, so it's all done through the military, it's all top secret, and it will remain that way up until NASA was created. So, White Sands, New Mexico, we literally pick up right where the Nazis left off, and we're using the same officers and scientists, particularly Wernher von Braun and his team. So we get out there in 1946, and we're basically rebuilding these V-2 rockets that have been brought over, and we're using them as sounding rockets. So a sounding rocket is essentially used to carry scientific instruments into Earth's upper atmosphere and into suborbital space. And they're essentially taking all these measurements of things in the upper atmosphere. They're taking measurements of the craft itself. They're getting all this telemetry data. They're testing other things like parachute recovery of instrumentation. And in 1946, there's a cool experiment where the Naval Research Laboratory launch took the first photographs of the sun in the ultraviolet spectrum up to an altitude of 88 kilometers or 55 miles. The first photograph of the Earth from space was taken from V-2 number 13, which was launched on 24 October of 1946. And it was aboard these modified V-2 rockets where the first animals would be sent into space. So on 20 February 1947, a bunch of fruit flies were aboard the U.S. launched V-2 rocket from the White Sands Proving Ground. And the purpose of this experiment was to explore the effects of radiation at high altitudes. And in this experiment, the capsule that the fruit flies were in was ejected successfully and recovered successfully. It wasn't damaged. And they found that the fruit flies were still alive. And they found that the radiation effects were kind of negligible. And in 1949, the age of sending primates into space took off when Albert II, a rhesus monkey, became the first primate and mammal in space. That happened on June 14th. And this kicked off the whole monkeys in space craze that would carry throughout the 50s. And to be honest, since that's a fascinating subject that gets largely overshadowed when we look at space history, let's talk about that. So before humans went into space, there was a whole variety of animals being launched into space. Most famously, we remember Laika, the dog that the Soviets launched in 1951 and was the goodest girl ever in space. But before her, America was already launching various animals into space. And we're doing this in order to investigate the biological effects of spaceflight because we needed to know what spaceflight would do to eventually the human body. At this time, we had no idea what would happen to our bodies in, say, a zero-G environment. We didn't know if it was possible to digest our food. We didn't know if our eyes were going to pop out of our head. Hell, we didn't even know if our blood would be able to pump inside our bodies at zero-G. It was all just a shot in the dark. But this is the part where we talk about the monkeys. So between 1948 and 1961, over 32 non-human primates flew into space. Now, all of these primates only flew once, and there were numerous other primates. They were like backup primates in this program, but they never got to fly. So this was a pretty big program. And there were several different species of primates used. There were rhesus macaques, crab-eating macaques, squirrel monkeys, pig-tailed macaques, and most famously chimpanzees. Now, it all starts with Albert I in 1948. And he was a rhesus macaque, and the way they were training these monkeys all had to do with these simple tasks of pulling a certain lever when a light went off, and then they would get these banana pellets as a reward. And these monkeys were basically put in this little capsule that had these little lights and these levers and this banana pellet reward system. That capsule was just slightly bigger than the monkey. It was basically just there to protect him. And then you had the nose cone and the payload and all that stuff with the rocket. It was all kind of separate. So he's in this little internal capsule up in the payload. And in these early days, everything was basically running on timers because we didn't really have the technology there yet to do it in any different way. It's not like today where we can push a button down at the ground station or whatever and make changes in flight. Everything was done based on timers. But I'm getting a little off topic. So they were training these monkeys to pull these levers at these specific times when these lights lit up, and they were like, okay, so we're going to take this monkey and now we're going to put him in the capsule, and we're going to put all these probes and stuff on them and in them and sensors and whatnot, and we're going to shoot the things into space and see what happens. So Albert I, he's the first one to go up. So on 18 of June 1948, he's anesthetized, he's put in the capsule, placed into the nose of the V2 rocket, and subsequently he takes off at 3:22 p.m. However, before the rocket even launches, the systems that were intended to record Albert's respiratory functions had failed. And it's believed that Albert died of suffocation either before the launch or during the launch. And this launch was basically a total failure. It failed to reach orbital space. This was due to the turbine burning out prematurely, and it only reached an altitude of 39 miles or 62 kilometers. So they fell short of the Kármán line, which is considered that general boundary between Earth and space. And even when the capsule was returning to Earth, the parachute failed, so even if the monkey was still alive at this time, he would have died upon impact. So all around, this test was a total failure. They weren't able to gather any kind of usable data from this test. All they could really say about this test was, hey, we launched a dead monkey into the high upper atmosphere. But rocket science being rocket science, they were able to take what they learned from that initial disaster and apply it towards the launch of Albert II. He was a rhesus monkey who would take off on June 14, 1945 on rocket number 47, and he was actually able to make it into space. However, his parachute also failed upon impact, but he survived impact. But just barely. I think he did eventually die like a day or two later. On September 16, 1945, Albert III, a crab-eating macaque, he died below the Kármán line at 35,000 feet when his V2 rocket exploded. And then on December 8th of that same year, Albert IV, he flew into space, but he died on impact when his parachute failed to deploy. he was the last of the V2 monkeys, because by then the V2 had gone through so many improvements that it was now the Aerobee rocket. It still used the same basic V2 platform, but it was essentially that next generation. And these further Aerobee rockets had kind of mixed success with monkeys. So on April 18th, 1951, a monkey possibly called Albert V died due to a parachute failure, becoming a theme here at this point. And then on 20 September 1951, a monkey called Yorick, also known as Albert VI, along with 11 mouse crewmates, reached 236,000 feet and survived the landing, the first monkey to do so. And although he did survive the flight and essentially get away unscathed, he did end up dying 2 hours later from the conditions of the capsule he was in. And this was because these capsules would come down in the New Mexico desert, and then you'd have to send a recovery team out to get them, and the whole time they're just sitting in this hot capsule baking in the sun, and it basically is killing these animals. So he most likely died from something like heat exhaustion or something like that. In May of 1952, 2 crab-eating macaques named Patricia and Mike, they survived their flight. And throughout the 50s, we get several other flights with several other monkeys, but it really isn't until 1959 when we graduate from monkeys to chimpanzees. And the first chimpanzee to be shot into space, or the first of the great apes to be shot into space, was a chimpanzee named Ham, later known as Ham the Astrochimp. Now, this is during the Mercury program, where we're still trying to figure everything out when it comes to the effects of humans in spaceflight. And on January 31st, 1961, Ham flew a suborbital flight on the Mercury Redstone 2 rocket. Now, by this time in the space race, the Soviets were making great strides, so we had already seen Laika and Sputnik, and not long after this, a few months later, we would see Yuri Gagarin take his place as the first human in space. And we were essentially scrambling to create NASA as kind of a response to this, because they really wanted to take it out of the realm of super secret military research and create a true civilian organization, which is NASA, what we know as today. And to be honest, we really had to create NASA for those propagandistic purposes, because when Sputnik launched in 1957, the average American really had no idea about our own research into rocketry and spaceflight. This was all being done through the military. So it gave Americans this idea that we had fallen behind the Soviets when it came to this great adventure in space. So the Eisenhower and subsequently the Kennedy administrations really had to push for this civilian space force to essentially prove to Americans that, no, we're not behind the Soviets, we have our own stuff, you just don't know about it. And it's during the Kennedy era where the term space race really kicks off. It becomes this pissing contest between the Soviet Union and the United States for space supremacy. And Kennedy, he essentially gives that famous speech about going to the moon in order to basically throw down the gauntlet and say, hey, whoever gets to the moon first is the winner. Despite the fact that up to this point, the Soviets were very successful in their own space program, they had many feats. I didn't really go into them here, but if you really want to hear about it, you can listen to the Lost Cosmonauts episode with the really terrible audio. Or you can listen to my follow-up episode on that, the Lost Cosmonauts Revisited episode. That one has terrible audio too, but I really go into how the space race and the creation of NASA and the idea of the Soviet Union being the country that gave us a severely dangerous garbage space agency is all propaganda. You can go listen to those episodes. I'm not going to repeat myself here. But this is when the space race, the journey to the moon, really becomes a thing. So like always, I'm 30 minutes into this and just finally getting to the point after laying down all this background information. But as always, we know that all that information is foundational and critical when it comes to this conspiracy theory. Now, I'm not going to go into every single NASA mission and all the details. If you want that information, it's out there. You can literally just go to nasa.gov or Wikipedia. It's out there. But it really does all start with Project Mercury. And this project really only had one main goal: get a human into space and return him safely, ideally before the Soviet Union can do it. And they're essentially being done on these Redstone and Atlas rockets, so think of it like a family tree. So those sounding rockets that they were using to send up the monkeys, that was kind of one branch of how the V2 kind of evolved. But then there's this other branch that kind of broke off and evolved off of this V2 model that became the Redstone rockets and the Jupiter rockets and eventually the Atlas and Mercury rockets. And this would be the rockets that the first Americans would take into space. And Project Mercury is where they're really figuring out the basics. They create the Mercury capsule, and these were supposed to carry supplies and water and food sufficient for a day. And they essentially have to work from scratch. They have to basically learn about heat shields and re-entry and parachutes and all this stuff that goes into spaceflight. And obviously they're building upon this previous research, especially from these monkey tests, which eventually showed that it is possible to basically fire a primate up there and that the primate is capable of surviving. So they basically move everything to Cape Canaveral and to Houston, and they get to work. And this wasn't like how NASA is today. Today, NASA is kind of an afterthought, but back then, this was huge. This was enormous. They were pumping, I think it was up to like 3% of our tax dollars into this program, which when you adjust that to what we give them today, it's just a drop in a bucket compared to what we gave them before. Hell, now Congress hands out more money to their billionaire friends and corporate entities than they give to NASA. But then again, our system is so corrupt now, it's just laughable to call it a republic. But I digress. So we're pouring billions of dollars into this program, and we create this network of hubs that will create everything to support this program across the country. And obviously from that, we're attracting the best scientists and fighter pilots in the nation. And at this time, essentially the whole country comes together to accept this challenge. We're going to send a man into space. And to be honest, in order to do this was a huge endeavor because you have to pull all these resources in because you have to think about every possibility. Not only are we thinking about rockets and heat shields and pressurization and oxygen, we have to think about things like the effects of weightlessness. We have to think about essentially the flight suits that these astronauts were going to wear. All the details down to the most mundane switches. And things that we wouldn't even think of, like how was the seat going to be bolted down in the craft? Was a person going to be laying down or sitting upright? And the biggest space question of all, they had to think of how are these people going to go to the bathroom? So it's essentially a complete logistical nightmare. However, we do eventually figure it out, and we do eventually send up Alan Shepard and John Glenn and the other 5 who everybody forgets. And while we don't beat the Soviets because Yuri Gagarin gets there in April, we do eventually take those next steps, which would lead us into our next goal of getting to the moon, and that would really take off in the Gemini program. So essentially, Mercury lays the foundations for Gemini, and Gemini lays the foundations for Apollo. And I don't remember which astronaut said it, but it was one of these early, I think Mercury 7 astronauts, when they asked him what he thought when he was first strapped down in that rocket and going to go into space. And he said his first thought was the fact that everything in this capsule was built by the lowest bidder, which is just typical of government contracts. Everything's built by the lowest bidder, which really makes one wonder why stuff just doesn't fall out of the sky, but I digress. And I don't think people realize just how lightning fast these guys were working. They were working day and night. They're designing and redesigning and working on all these systems that are going to put men just into space. And that's why it seems like it happened at a rapid pace, because essentially it does happen at a rapid pace. And it's not like humans aren't capable of that. I mean, look at how rapidly SpaceX is developing and redesigning their engines and their super heavy rockets. So to think that it's outside the realm of possibility that we would develop spaceflight so quickly is just stupid, especially when you have thousands of people pouring millions of dollars worth of resources into these projects. And Gemini is a critical link in between getting people into space and getting people to the moon, because it was through the Gemini program where we would really develop all of these techniques that we would need to develop to get men to the moon. Now, the Gemini spacecrafts were able to carry crews of 2, which is a good enhancement. And a big part of these maneuvers were rendezvous and docking. You had to be able to dock your spacecraft with each other if you had any hopes of making it to the moon or back. It was also during Gemini where we would have to demonstrate human endurance during spaceflight. For example, they had to basically be up there for 2 weeks, or at the very least 8 days. And it was during Gemini where we basically had to figure out all the nuances of EVAs. We had to see if astronauts were capable of performing any kind of duties outside of their vehicles and in these bulky spacesuits. And finally, in Gemini, they had to test techniques of atmospheric re-entry. Now, while we were building on work for that was been going on since the 40s, we had to ensure the safety of our crews. It's not like the monkey experiments from a few years prior where they didn't really care if the monkey died or not. It's a little bit different when you're talking about a human. Kill a few monkeys in space, nobody bats an eye, but kill a human in space, then you have a propaganda problem on your hands. And without going into all the details, Gemini was a large success and it led the way for Apollo. And Apollo is where it all comes together. It is the big mission. It's where humans are going to go to the moon. And not only were they going to go there, they were going to come back safely. This was the big one. This was that gauntlet that Kennedy threw down in 1961, where he said, we are going to go to the moon and do the other things. And this was all going to be done on the backs of the Saturn rockets, most notoriously the Saturn V, which by this time has come from a long evolution of rockets. This was the Super Heavy of its day. And I don't think people really understand or can perceive how big the Saturn V was. This thing was enormous. If you see the thing in real life, I think it's on display in Alabama still, Huntsville particularly, because Huntsville's where they built and still build everything for NASA. But if you saw these things in real life, you would really understand how that thing was able to lift this capsule into space. This thing is enormous. And the Saturn V rocket would be used from about 1967 to 1973. I believe the first time it was used was with Apollo 4. And that was the first real test of the Saturn V rocket with all systems on board, and it's basically like simulating a launch. And it really qualified the vehicle. The vehicle essentially passed this test. That was followed up by Apollo 5, which was the uncrewed first flight of the Apollo lunar module, also known as the LEM. That would be the module that would land on the moon. They essentially were testing all its stuff without going into too much detail. It was later followed by Apollo 7, which was the first crewed flight to take place in the Apollo mission, since they put a moratorium on crewed flights after the Apollo 1 disaster. This mission spent 10 days in Earth's orbit, and this gave NASA the confidence to carry on with the preparations for Apollo 8, in which the first astronauts would leave Earth's orbit and travel to the moon. And I feel like Apollo 8 really does get overshadowed by later missions, particularly Apollo 11, for obvious reasons. But I don't think I can express the importance of this mission. This was a human first. We weren't just going up and orbiting the Earth and learning all these things that we learned back in the Mercury and Gemini programs. This was where we really put it into the test. This was the first time we were going to go beyond the Van Allen belts into essentially real space. And we were going to orbit the moon. And I mentioned this and the Van Allen belts because that is a note of contention when it comes to moon landing deniers. They literally will state that there's so much radiation in these belts that it would literally kill people, and all this radiation is super dangerous and you're going to get cancer and die, and it's going to like short out and break the instruments, or whatever random bullshit they come up with. But in reality, it's not really that extreme. Yes, solar radiation outside of Earth's orbit and influence is a little bit higher, but it's not so high that it's going to immediately kill you or give you cancer. When you look at the actual numbers when it comes to the radiation doses they were subjected to, it was no more than 2 rads over 6 days, on average. And the thing with the Van Allen belts is they passed through them so quickly that any effects from those were negligible. Plus, the capsule they were in was shielded against radiation. People say, oh, there's no way they had shielding against radiation. Of course they did. They weren't stupid. It just wasn't thick lead plates like we normally think of when we think of radiation shielding. The shielding was actually made of the more lightweight metal aluminum. However, through some clever usage in math, it provided the same protection that you would have from 7mm thick lead plates. So when these people are harping on the radiation issue, they're just being fucking stupid, because if the radiation was really that bad, we wouldn't be able to send all these probes and stuff to places like Mars and all these other moons and that one that they sent to the asteroid that they shot. Hell, if it was as bad as these conspiracy theorists claim, Voyagers 1 and 2 wouldn't have even made it into deep space. And they're still just trucking along way out there beyond the Kuiper Belt. And they're still sending back data, and to be honest, I think the Voyager missions are my favorite NASA missions. But I'm digressing, let's get back to the topic. So Apollo 8 goes up and it's this huge success, and it's the first time that humans ever see or experience the dark side of the moon. And I'm not going to go into the subject of tidal locking because even though I understand the general idea of tidal locking, it's all over my head. For some reason, I'm completely incapable of visualizing it. But overall, Apollo 8 is a huge success, and that paves the way for the future Apollo missions. Now, Apollo 9, that was another low Earth orbit mission. That mission was primarily to qualify the lunar module for lunar operations. They're essentially just proving that this vehicle is capable of docking and flying and all that fun stuff while it's up there orbiting the moon. And then not too long after, Apollo 10 goes up and it goes back to the moon and they orbit the moon, and this is essentially a dress rehearsal for the moon landing. And during this mission, they are literally doing everything short of actually descending down to the moon. And it was during this mission where they're really scouting out where the next mission, Apollo 11, was going to land. So they're taking all these photographs of the Sea of Tranquility. And then we get to the big one, the show, the star of the day, Apollo 11, which everybody still claims happened on a soundstage out in like Area 51, and it was all directed by Stanley Kubrick. And this is the mission that everybody picks apart. So Apollo 11 is the big mission, and to be honest, it was almost a disaster. But we gotta remember something about these early astronauts. These guys were true blue American heroes. These guys, a lot of them were World War II vets, a lot of them were test pilots for the US military, and to be honest, it's really understated. These guys were geniuses. And by genius, I mean these are the type of guys that you see who can perform calculus in their head. So these were tough dudes, and they knew that they could potentially die during these missions. So they didn't go into this stuff lightly. They had hundreds of hours of training, if not thousands. They had the logistical support of an entire nation behind them. And during Apollo, NASA was at its zenith. They were pouring billions of dollars into NASA. And they had something like 40,000 people working directly or indirectly towards this program. So on July 16th, Apollo 11 takes off, and it makes its way towards the moon. And they chose this particular day of the month because the angle of the sun itself, where it hit the Sea of Tranquility, was taken into account in order to make the shifting temperature extremes on the moon a little more habitable for those astronauts. Of course, they had other ways to kind of limit some of those temperature extremes as well. The suits, for example, they're white because white is reflective. They had them dark sun visors, and there was all these layers to the suits. And they even had some kind of rudimentary cooling system as well. I think it was liquid-based. So Apollo launches and it makes its way to the moon. It takes about 3 days to get there. On July 19th, as Apollo passes behind the moon, it fires its service propulsion engine to enter lunar orbit. And during this time when they're in lunar orbit, they're doing all their prep work for this descent. They're scoping out the Sea of Tranquility to make sure it's going to be a good landing site because they're still not 100% sure. Then at 12:52 UTC on 20 July, Aldrin and Armstrong enter the Eagle. The lander will take them to the moon. They do their final checks and then they disengage from the Columbia, the lunar orbiter, the one that Collins is in, the third guy that everybody forgets about. So this is where it almost goes all wrong. So as the descent begins, Armstrong and Aldrin found themselves passing the landmarks on the surface about 2 to 3 seconds before they were intended to make it to those landmarks. So they realized that they're coming in a little too fast and that they were going to land several miles west of their intended target. So 5 minutes into this descent burn and 6,000 feet or 1,800 meters above the lunar surface, the LM guidance computer started throwing out all these errors. Basically, these errors stated that the computer couldn't perform its tasks in real time and had to delay some of them. And for context, these computers were dumber than your average wristwatch or calculator. To be honest, I think these computers were running on something like 4 kilobytes. And if you want to visualize that, that is about the processing power of an Atari 2600 game. However, they're basically reassured by ground control that everything's fine and the mission is safe to continue. Basically, the quick fix for this was built into the computer software itself. It was just basically told to eliminate low priority tasks and focus on the important stuff, and this actually prevented an abort of the mission. But this is where it starts to get crazy. So when Armstrong looked outside, he saw that the computer's landing target was in a boulder-strewn area just north and east of a 300-foot crater. So he starts to take over control of the lander, and he notices a boulder field, and he thinks, maybe I can stop short of that boulder field. However, due to their horizontal velocity, he was coming in a little too fast still, a little too high. And Armstrong is sitting there beside him, cool as a cucumber, just belting out navigation data while Armstrong was piloting the Eagle. So Armstrong's kind of scoping the horizon, and he finds a clear patch of ground. However, as he got closer, about 250 feet up, he sees that this new site also has a crater in it. So he clears this crater. However, as he does so, he's about 100 feet off the ground at this point, and it's kicking up all this lunar regolith and dust. And this starts to impair his ability to determine the spacecraft's motion. However, he starts focusing on these boulders, and that gives him an idea of speed. So at 100 meters up, he's descending, he's almost out of fuel, and somehow by his and Aldrin's skill, they come to a soft landing on the lunar surface. A probe that had jutted out of one of the footpads indicated contact. They shut the engine down, and that was that. And that brings us to another, note of contention when it comes to conspiracy theorists. They say, well, where's the big crater that was supposed to be under the module when it landed? And to that, I do have a few answers. First off, we're not in Earth's atmosphere, so a craft like that coming in isn't going to have to deal with, the same pressures and gravitational forces that we deal with here on Earth. Secondly, it didn't come down like a SpaceX rocket ship coming down onto its launch pad. They kind of glided and drifted in. It was more like watching an airplane land. So I don't know what fantasy world you're living in, but normally in a maneuver like that, you don't create a big blast crater under the lander when you're basically gliding to a stop. So after this wild ride down to the moon, Buzz Aldrin, he's going over there post-touchdown checklist, and ground control is like, oh my god, we almost didn't do it. It was almost a crash. Now, a lot of people think that the lunar module landed and then they immediately got out and went on their EVA, their spacewalk, their walk around the moon. But it really didn't happen like that because they had other stuff they had to do. Initially in the mission, it was stated that they would take maybe a 5-hour rest period before they would exit the vehicle. It wasn't until 6 hours and 39 minutes after landing when everything was prepared and the lunar module was depressurized before they finally said, okay, we're ready to go outside. So they open the hatch and Armstrong is descending down this 9-rung ladder. And partway down, he pulls this D-ring, and this D-ring is very important because it contained the modular equipment storage assembly, which was folded up on the outside of the Eagle against the side. So it essentially kind of rolls out, and this deploys the camera in which we see that descent, that famous descent from the module. So if you ever wondered, well, how did that camera get out there first? Well, that's how it happened. Now, Apollo 11 used a slow scan television to broadcast these images from the moon. And slow scan television signals are incompatible with normal television signals that we see VHF, UHF. So that's part of why it looks very low quality and grainy, also considering the fact you're shooting from the fucking moon. But this signal was perfectly fine for the monitor that ground control was using. So the cameramen, the reporters from the conventional TV channels, which in America was 3 channels at the time, NBC, ABC, and CBS, they point their cameras at this monitor and they're broadcasting what they're seeing on this monitor. Now, this feed was also being sent to Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station near Canberra in Australia. And then it was switched to the Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia, and that created a clearer feed, but essentially over 600 million people were able to view this moon landing. And to be honest, that's a lot of fucking people. This is at a time where the world population, I think, was only around 3.5 billion. It's funny to think that it's more than doubled since then, but I digress. So that's why the image is so grainy, because you're watching a broadcast of a broadcast coming from slow scan television signals. So of course you're going to get some terrible video quality there. Of course, he descends down the ladder, he says those famous words, and the rest is history. One of the first thing Armstrong did was he took out this bag and this stick and collected some lunar soil and put it in this little pocket he had on his thigh. They then took the camera off of this little bundle that it was on and stuck it on a tripod, and they were able to move it around and get those panoramic shots. They also had kind of a remote type setup that they could use, and this remote setup would be used when they would ascend back to command module on their descent, but right now we're on the moon. So let's start dispelling some myths. So the first thing is there's that whole idea that a blast of wind came in and that's why the flag is waving, and that's not true at all. The flag was hung on this post, and this post had an armature on it, and this armature was very springy. It would kind of flop back and forth if you just touched it. And that was kind of a weight reduction thing. And you can clearly see in some of the footage while they are messing with the flag that this springy action is causing this flag to wave. And anytime they even get close to this thing and kind of even slightly bump it, it causes this motion. So the idea that a gust of wind kicked up is kind of ludicrous, because even if a gust of wind did kick up, that's not how the flag is going to move in a gust of wind. It's like, have you ever seen a flag before in the wind? It moves in the natural kind of pattern that is not reflected when this flag is waving on the moon. Then we get into the question of the stars, and the question is, well, if you're on a surface with no atmosphere, why can't you see stars? And when I hear that, the first question I always ask is the same reason you don't see stars in a city at night. They get washed out. And there are 3 distinct things washing out these stars in these photos. For one, the sun. It's essentially a giant light. 2, the very surface of the moon itself is very reflective. Lunar soil is very glass-like, and it is extremely reflective. It's literally why the moon lights up so brightly, and that brightness is going to wash out anything like a star that is several light years away. And even when they're doing their navigation in space, they're not looking at stars with their naked eyes. Usually when they're looking through those windows, they're looking at stars through various ocular devices like glorified telescopes in order to find these stars. And the third thing is it comes down to the cameras themselves. The apertures on the cameras were almost completely closed, and you had to have these long exposure times. And that's just due to the fact that these cameras had to be built in a way where they didn't have flashes. They had to be almost a dark box because the reflection of all of that regolith on the moon would have washed out most of the images. And then that gets us into the question of the shadows. A lot of people say, well, the shadows are supposed to be parallel, the shadows are supposed to be like this. How come this guy is brightly lit when he's in shadow? And for one, these people that propose this stuff, they don't know how the fuck shadows work. Even on Earth, shadows aren't parallel, so that makes no sense. And to be honest, the reason you see like an astronaut being lit up while he's in shadow just comes from the fact that the sunlight is hitting in a certain way and that's being reflected to the camera. You're seeing what the camera is seeing. And anybody who's ever used a damn camera in their life know that whatever the camera sees is going to be different from your own field of vision. Just try standing on your balcony or something and taking a picture of the moon at night. You're going to see two vastly different things concerning what your eyes are seeing and what the camera is seeing. Of course, then the conspiracy theorists will talk about things like, well, when that one astronaut fell on that later mission, it looks like he's just pulled up by a wire. Or, why did they walk like this? It looks like if I just sped up that footage, they'd be walking normal as if they were in Earth's gravity. And all of this can easily be explained by the fact that they're not on fucking Earth, so they're not subject to our gravity at the time. Lunar gravity is something like, 1/6 of Earth's gravity? So for example, it's very easy to spring right back up from a fall and make it look unnatural. It's very easy to jump extremely high. It's simply due to the fact that you weigh less on the moon. You're not going to have natural human Earth movements on a body that has 1/6 of gravity. Of course, then the theorists will start cherry-picking low-quality photographs. They'll start saying, well, look, see, this is clearly where the horizon is, and you can see that that's painted as if it's in a movie set. And they always pick the lowest quality images they can find in order to make this point. However, people forget that humans evolved on Earth with a thick atmosphere, and we judge distance usually by haze in our atmosphere. We're designed to look through haze in order to judge how far something is away. Well, the moon doesn't have an atmosphere per se. There's no haze, so something that is dozens of miles away can look as if it's right there in front of you. And if you're looking for it, it can give the illusion that you're looking at a film set. Basically what I'm getting at is literally every argument moon landing conspiracy theorists come up with can easily be debunked. Even during the ascent, when they're leaving the moon and going back up to the command module to dock, they say it looks like it was just pulled up by a cable. That ascent is unnatural looking, and why isn't there a big plume of fire or something coming out? Well, remember, first off, you're in space. You're essentially in a vacuum. Secondly, the escape velocity of the moon is much smaller than that of the escape velocity of Earth, so you don't need a big, Saturn V rocket. And lastly, of course, it looks fucking unnatural. You're on the moon. Nothing is going to look natural in the way that you see it on Earth. And I think that's a lot of disconnect that these theorists have. They're looking at things that aren't natural, that don't make sense to them, that don't look like they're supposed to on Earth, and they miss the fucking point that they're not on fucking Earth. They're essentially on a different world where, of course, nothing is going to look natural. Of course, then that all leads us to the question of why haven't we been back? Well, post the Apollo missions, NASA really did switch directions in order to focus on more low Earth orbit stuff. They were focused on different sciences. Essentially by the 80s, a new generation had come in, and it wasn't this old generation of the daredevil pilots going up there and doing these great feats of heroism for the country. NASA had become the realm of scientists who really wanted to focus on various different experiments. They wanted to focus on things like space stations and telescopes and satellites and probes. And the idea of daredevil space exploration took a back seat. Of course, also, even by the time of Apollo 13, interest in putting a man on the moon had waned at that point. Nobody cared anymore. Hell, even the broadcast of the launch of Apollo 13 was preempted by something else on television. It had become boring, mundane, routine. And that lack of public interest caused a real lack of funding at NASA. Because remember, NASA is funded by our tax dollars. It's all through our federal government. And in the 70s and 80s, this took a sharp decline to which it has never recovered. So the focus had to shift away from that. And of course, there was always the fact that the whole point of getting to the moon was just to basically tell the Soviets, hey, look what we can do, we're better than you. But essentially the whole culture of NASA shifted. It was now considered a STEM career. It was something that scientists and engineers went into. And to be honest, that really kind of hurt it and held it back for several decades after the 60s. Basically, those downturns in funding and that lack of interest from the general public made it somewhat of an afterthought that you sometimes hear about on the news. However, that's not true of everybody. For myself, I'm fascinated by things like astronomy and space and sciences and going to the moon and the probes on Mars. And like I said, Voyager 1 and 2, that's like my favorite NASA mission because it just fascinates me how these probes from the 70s are still going out there to this day. Hell, I love it so much that I even entered my name into that message in a bottle program where they basically take your name and they put it with all these other names and it's on this little chip that's on the backside of this plate that has this poem. And it's on that probe that's heading to Europa on that mission that just recently launched. So for myself, and I guess countless others, it's still very fascinating and I really wish we could, I don't know, maybe take some of our funding from the military or some of that funding that, Congress just gives to their billionaire corporate buddies and give it back to NASA so we can finally get back to the moon and to Mars because that's the next step in this ongoing space race. Because now most countries of the world are interested in the exploration of space and Mars is the next big step. And that's the whole point of the Artemis program right now, and that's the whole point of SpaceX right now. Of course, then a lot of people will say, well, if we had the technology back then to get to the moon, it seems like we don't have the technology anymore. We still do have the technology to get to the moon. However, we gotta remember it's very difficult and very wasteful. We could literally go out tomorrow and build a Saturn V. I mean, we literally have them sitting on display. We know how they were built. We could do that if we wanted to. But the thing is, a rocket like the Saturn V, it's one-time use. You put a ton of resources into it, you get one use out of it, and it basically ends up at the bottom of the ocean. It's super expensive, it's super wasteful, so you have to go to that next step, reusable rockets, which is what Elon Musk has been really big into looking into today. And there are other smaller companies out there doing the same thing, and they've had various degrees of success. However, SpaceX is probably the most successful when it comes to reusability. I mean, look at the Falcon 9. But it's all baby steps. If we want to get to Mars, there's a long way to go. And unfortunately, we don't have that massive amount of funding and that come-togetherness like we did back during the Cold War. Of course, with modern politics, if we did have a huge federal spending budget that we could just give to NASA, you'd get a bunch of naysayers going, well, why can't you use that tax money for this or that or this or that? And it essentially becomes a political nightmare. But I'm off on another tangent now. Let's get back to the topic. So, the moon landing. Did it happen? Yes. Not only did it happen once, it happened several times. 6 times, in fact. Apollos 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17. And if you listen to my Season 3 episode about Apollo 20, maybe it happened a few more times. And maybe the Soviets got involved too. But go listen to that episode if you're interested in that. Of course, that one's basically a fictional rehash of a film plot, 2 film plots, a YouTube hoax, and I think there was a book as well. But it's a fun ride if you're interested. So, the moon landing. No one can convince me that we didn't do it because no one is capable of keeping a secret like that. I mean, do you honestly think an entire generation was capable of keeping a secret for military and propaganda reasons? No. If the thousands of people who directly and indirectly worked on these programs believed that it was all for nothing and it was all a hoax and it was all going to be filmed in some soundstage in Area 51, then they wouldn't have fucking did it. And to be honest, it's really all I have to say on that. Now, I know this episode was a bit of a ramble. I did touch upon a ton of topics, and there's a ton of stuff that I just skipped over because if I hadn't, this episode would have been like 4 hours long and I would have never gotten it done. But as always, this is Mike. I do thank you for listening. Feel free to check it out on the social medias, Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram and Threads and YouTube a little bit. However, our primary home will always be on Spotify. Despite that weird Spotify scandal right now where they fired a bunch of people and now it's just an AI algorithm. But despite that, you can always help the show out just by sharing it with your friends. Word of mouth really helps. It's what literally grows this show. And as always, if you do like what I'm doing and you want to support in a more direct way, there's that link in the description of every episode. Follow that and just follow those steps. Once again, I thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.